In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where rows of houses stood neatly aligned and lawns sparkled with freshly cut grass, Greg Anderson lived what most would describe as an ordinary life. His home wasn't the biggest or fanciest on the block, but it had charm, especially his front yard. To Greg, that patch of green was more than just grass. It was his pride and joy. Every weekend, he spent hours tending to it, trimming the edges, watering the soil, and making sure not a single weed dared to grow. It was his little slice of paradise in a world that often felt chaotic. But there was one thing, or rather one person, that constantly disrupted Greg's peaceful existence. Karen. Karen lived down the street, and while she wasn't exactly unpopular, she was certainly known throughout the neighborhood for her strong opinions and knack for bending rules to suit herself. She was also deeply involved in the Homeowners Association, HOA, which gave her a certain level of authority over everyone else. Some people respected her for her dedication to keeping the community orderly, but others found her domineering and hard to deal with. Karen's car, a flashy red convertible, was almost as loud and attention-seeking as she was, and every single day without fail, she tore through Greg's front yard like it was her personal racetrack. It didn't matter if it was morning, afternoon, or evening. Greg could count on hearing the roar of her engine and seeing those tires leave ugly marks across his once pristine lawn. At first, he thought maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe Karen had taken a wrong turn or needed to avoid something on the road. But after weeks of the same routine, it became painfully clear. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. The shortcut saved Karen a good 5 minutes off her commute, and apparently those 5 minutes were worth destroying someone else's property. Greg tried not to let it bother him at first. After all, what could he do? Confronting, Karen seemed risky given her reputation, so he decided to take a calmer approach. He went out of his way to be polite, waving whenever he saw her drive by and even striking up conversations when their paths crossed. During these brief exchanges, Greg casually mentioned how much effort he put into maintaining his lawn. He hoped that by appealing to her sense of reason, or perhaps even guilt, she might reconsider using his yard as her personal highway. Unfortunately, Karen didn't seem to care. In fact, she acted as though Greg's comments went right over her head. The shortcuts continued, and so did the damage. Tire tracks crisscrossed his lawn like scars, marring the beauty he worked so hard to create. Each new mark felt like a personal insult, a reminder that Karen viewed his property as nothing more than a convenience. Greg began to dread the sound of her engine revving, knowing what was coming next. Feeling defeated but unwilling to give up, Greg decided to escalate his efforts. He wrote a formal complaint to the HOA, detailing the situation and attaching photos of the tire marks as evidence. Surely they would see how unreasonable Karen was being and step in to help. But instead of siding with Greg, the HOA dismissed his concerns. According to them, since Karen technically wasn't breaking any specific rules about driving through private property, there was nothing they could do. They suggested Greg talk to her directly if he wanted the behavior to stop. This response left Greg feeling powerless. How could the very organization meant to protect homeowners' rights ignore such blatant disrespect? He couldn't understand why no one else seemed bothered by Karen's actions. When he brought up the issue with a few neighbors, most shrugged it off. Some admitted they sympathized with him but didn't want to get involved. Others laughed nervously, saying things like, "That's just Karen being Karen." Even worse, a couple of people hinted that maybe Greg should lighten up. "It's just grass," one neighbor said dismissively. "It'll grow back." But to Greg, it wasn't just grass. It represented time, effort, and pride. Every blade mattered because it symbolized his commitment to creating something beautiful in a world that often overlooked small acts of care. Watching Karen tear through his lawn day after day made him feel invisible, as though his contributions to the neighborhood didn't matter. The frustration gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing week. As the days turned into months, Greg started noticing subtle changes in himself. He found himself peeking through the curtains whenever he heard a car approaching, hoping against hope that it wouldn't be Karen. If it was, he'd watch silently, fists clenched, as she sped across his lawn without a second thought. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit outside staring at the damaged grass, imagining ways to make her stop. Most ideas were harmless, like putting up signs or planting thorny bushes, but occasionally, darker thoughts crept in. What if he could teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget? Despite his mounting anger, Greg knew he couldn't act on those impulses. Or could he? The idea lingered in the back of his mind, tempting him with its simplicity. If Karen refused to respect his property, then maybe it was time to show her just how serious he was about protecting it. Little did he know, this train of thought would soon lead him down a path he never expected, one that would test his morals, challenge his patience, and ultimately change the dynamics of the entire neighborhood. For now, though, Greg remained stuck in a cycle of frustration and helplessness, unsure of how to reclaim control of his own yard. The clash between him and Karen was far from over, and as tensions simmered beneath the surface, it was only a matter of time before something snapped. Greg's frustration with Karen's daily intrusions into his life grew deeper with each passing day. The tire marks on his lawn became more than just physical scars. They were constant reminders of how powerless he felt. No matter what he tried, nothing seemed to work. His polite conversations with Karen fell flat, and the HOA's refusal to take action left him feeling abandoned by the very system meant to protect homeowners like him. It was as if the universe itself had conspired against him, allowing Karen to trample over not just his grass but also his sense of dignity. Desperate for a solution, Greg began experimenting with different ways to deter Karen from using his yard as her personal shortcut. He started small, purchasing brightly colored signs that read, "Please keep off the grass," and planting them along the edge of his property. The signs were cheerful enough. Some even featured cute illustrations of flowers and butterflies. But they carried a clear message. This is private property and you are not welcome here. Greg hoped that seeing these visual cues would make Karen reconsider her actions. Surely she wouldn't ignore something so direct, right? Wrong. Karen barely glanced at the signs as she zoomed past them, her red convertible leaving fresh tire tracks in their wake. If anything, it almost seemed like she drove faster just to prove a point. Greg watched in disbelief as his attempt at peaceful communication failed miserably. The signs might as well have been invisible for all the attention Karen paid to them. Frustrated but undeterred, Greg decided to try something else. Next, he invested in decorative stones, large, smooth rocks that he arranged strategically around the perimeter of his lawn. These weren't just ordinary stones. They were heavy enough to create a physical barrier while still looking aesthetically pleasing. Greg figured that if Karen encountered obstacles in her path, she'd be forced to slow down or find another route altogether. Once again, he waited anxiously to see if his plan would succeed, but Karen didn't slow down. Instead, she simply drove over the stones, scattering them across the grass like toys pushed aside by a stubborn child. By the time Greg returned home from work one evening, he found several of the stones lying haphazardly in his flower beds, having been dislodged by Karen's reckless driving. Not only had his second attempt failed, but it had also caused additional damage to his carefully cultivated garden. Greg sighed heavily, picking up the displaced stones one by one. This was getting ridiculous. Feeling increasingly desperate, Greg turned to online forums for advice. He spent hours scrolling through threads filled with stories from other frustrated homeowners who had dealt with similar issues. Some suggested installing low wooden barriers, while others recommended sprinkling gravel or sand to discourage cars from driving onto the grass. One particularly creative suggestion involved burying chicken wire just beneath the surface of the lawn, a harmless deterrent that would make driving uncomfortable without causing lasting harm. Inspired by the ideas he'd read, Greg decided to give wooden barriers a shot. He purchased sturdy planks of wood and hammered them into place along the edges of his property, creating a makeshift fence designed to block vehicles. As he worked, sweat dripping down his face under the afternoon sun, Greg allowed himself a flicker of hope. Maybe this would finally be the solution he'd been searching for. Maybe Karen would realize she couldn't keep treating his property like her personal racetrack. It wasn't long before reality came crashing back down. Early the next morning, Greg heard the familiar roar of Karen's engine. Peering out his window, he watched in dismay as she approached his lawn, paused briefly to assess the new obstacle, and then casually maneuvered around it. She didn't even hesitate, just swerved slightly to avoid the wooden barriers and continued tearing through his grass as though nothing had changed. Greg stood frozen, gripping the curtain tightly in his fist. How could someone be so brazen, so utterly dismissive of boundaries? As the days passed, Greg's frustration transformed into something darker: obsession. He couldn't stop thinking about Karen and her endless parade of disrespect. Every waking moment and many sleepless nights was consumed by thoughts of revenge. What kind of person ignored every reasonable request and treated others' property with such blatant disregard? And why did no one else seem willing to stand up to her? The injustice of it all burned inside him like a fire that refused to die. One evening, after yet another fruitless day of brainstorming solutions, Greg stumbled upon a thread in an online gardening forum that caught his eye. The topic was titled "Creative Ways to Protect Your Lawn," and among the usual suggestions about fences and signage, one comment stood out. A user joked about burying harmless spikes under the sod to deter people from walking across your grass. The idea was presented lightheartedly, almost sarcastically, but it planted a seed in Greg's mind that quickly took root. At first, Greg laughed off the suggestion. Buried spikes? That sounded extreme, not to mention risky. But the more he thought about it, the more appealing the concept became. If Karen refused to respect his property despite countless warnings and attempts to deter her, maybe it was time to show her the consequences of her actions. The spikes wouldn't hurt anyone, he reasoned. They'd simply puncture her tires, forcing her to deal with the inconvenience of changing them. Wasn't that fair, considering how much trouble she'd caused him? Greg wrestled with his conscience, torn between his desire for justice and the ethical implications of deliberately sabotaging someone's vehicle. On one hand, he knew it wasn't right to stoop to Karen's level, but on the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that he deserved some form of retribution. After months of enduring her selfish behavior and facing zero accountability, it felt like the only way to regain control of the situation. Late at night, when the neighborhood was quiet and the streets empty, Greg sat alone in his living room staring at the wall. His laptop lay open on the coffee table, the gardening forum still visible on the screen. The idea of buried spikes lingered in his mind, refusing to let go. He imagined Karen's reaction when she realized her tires had been punctured. Would she feel remorse? Or would she double down on her entitled attitude, blaming everyone but herself for the damage? Despite his internal conflict, Greg couldn't deny the thrill of imagining her comeuppance. For once, Karen would experience the same helplessness he'd felt for months. She'd learn what it meant to have her plans disrupted, her convenience shattered. And maybe, just maybe, she'd finally understand the importance of respecting others' boundaries. By the time dawn broke, Greg had made up his mind. He wasn't proud of the decision, but he convinced himself it was necessary. If Karen refused to listen to reason, then perhaps a little pain would teach her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. As the sun rose over the quiet suburban neighborhood, Greg woke up with a strange mix of excitement and unease. The decision he'd made the night before weighed heavily on his mind, but it also gave him a sense of purpose, a plan, however drastic, to finally put an end to Karen's relentless disregard for his property. For months he had tried everything within reason to stop her from tearing through his lawn, yet nothing worked. Now, as he prepared to take matters into his own hands in a way that bordered on extreme, he couldn't help but feel like this was his last chance to reclaim control. Greg spent the morning gathering supplies for his covert operation. He drove to a nearby hardware store and purchased short metal spikes designed for deterring animals from digging in gardens. They weren't sharp enough to cause serious harm, just sturdy enough to puncture rubber tires if driven over with enough force. At the checkout counter, Greg hesitated briefly, wondering if the cashier might suspect something unusual about his purchase. But when the man behind the register simply bagged the items without comment, Greg relaxed slightly. To anyone else, these spikes were just another gardening tool, Only Greg knew their true purpose. Back at home, Greg began carefully planning how to install the spikes. He wanted them to be effective but subtle, not so obvious that they could easily be spotted by someone looking closely at his lawn. After all, if Karen noticed anything suspicious before driving through, she might avoid the area entirely, ruining his plan. On the other hand, he didn't want to make the setup too complicated either. Simplicity would reduce the risk of mistakes. With precision in mind, Greg grabbed a shovel, some string, and a tape measure, then headed outside to mark out the areas where Karen's car tires always landed. The first step was digging narrow trenches beneath the sod. Greg chose 2 parallel lines along the most frequently used path across his lawn, ensuring the spikes would align perfectly with the width of Karen's tires. As he worked, sweat trickling down his forehead under the midday sun, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a line he'd never imagined himself approaching. This wasn't just installing garden decorations or building wooden barriers anymore. It was setting a trap. And though he told himself the spikes were harmless enough, guilt still tugged at the edges of his conscience. To bury the spikes properly, Greg placed them point side up in the shallow trenches, spacing them evenly apart so they wouldn't all cluster together in one spot. Then, he carefully covered them with thin layers of soil, patting it down gently to ensure the grass looked undisturbed. From above, the lawn appeared completely normal, lush, green, and inviting. There was no visible trace of the hidden danger lurking just below the surface. Satisfied with his work, Greg stepped back to admire his handiwork. It was almost poetic, he thought bitterly. Something so small and seemingly insignificant could bring someone like Karen to her knees, or at least force her to deal with flat tires. But even as pride swelled in his chest, Greg couldn't ignore the nagging voice inside his head. What if this went wrong? What if someone else accidentally drove over the spikes? Or worse, what if Karen got hurt trying to inspect the damage? He pushed those thoughts aside, reminding himself that this was Karen's fault, not his. She had ignored every reasonable request, disregarded the HOA's indifference, and trampled over his dignity time and again. If anyone deserved to face consequences, it was her. Over the next few days, Greg kept a close watch on his lawn, waiting anxiously for Karen to fall into his trap. Each time he heard a car engine revving nearby, his heart raced, and he peeked through the curtains to see if it was her. Surprisingly, Karen didn't show up during those first couple of days. Whether by coincidence or because she sensed something was different, she avoided his yard entirely. Greg began to wonder if his plan had somehow tipped her off, or worse, if she'd found another shortcut altogether. By the 3rd day, however, Greg's patience paid off. Just after lunchtime, he heard the unmistakable roar of Karen's red convertible speeding down the street. He rushed to the window and watched as she approached his house, tires squealing as she veered onto his lawn without hesitation. For a split second, Greg felt a pang of doubt. Was this really the right thing to do? But before he could second-guess himself further, Karen's car lurched violently, accompanied by a loud crunching sound. Her front tires hit the buried spikes exactly as Greg had planned, deflating instantly. Panicked, Karen slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of Greg's lawn. She jumped out of the car, heels sinking slightly into the soft grass, and hurried around to inspect the damage. Both front tires were shredded, their rubber punctured in multiple places by the hidden spikes. Greg watched silently from behind his curtains, his pulse racing as he observed her reaction. Karen's face turned bright red with anger, and she began pacing back and forth, muttering curses under her breath. Clearly, she had no idea what had caused the blowouts, and judging by her frantic gestures, she wasn't happy about it. For a moment, Greg allowed himself to savor the satisfaction of seeing Karen's usual confidence crumble. All those months of frustration, all the tire marks scarring his lawn, all the sleepless nights spent stewing over her entitled behavior. It had led to this. Finally, she was paying the price for her actions. But as Karen stormed toward his front door, fists clenched and eyes blazing with fury, Greg realized the situation was far from over. He opened the door before she could knock, feigning surprise at her presence. "Karen?" he asked innocently, raising an eyebrow. Is everything okay? Okay? Karen snapped, gesturing wildly at her car. Does this look okay to you? I just drove over your stupid lawn and now both my tires are ruined. What did you do to it? Greg blinked, pretending to be confused. What do you mean, what did I do? I haven't touched my lawn since yesterday. Maybe you hit something, sharp on the road. Don't play dumb with me, Karen shot back, jabbing a finger in his direction. This is your doing, isn't it? You sabotaged my car. Greg held up his hands defensively, maintaining his calm demeanor. That's ridiculous. Why would I sabotage your car? Besides, there's nothing dangerous on my lawn. You're welcome to check for yourself. Karen glared at him suspiciously, clearly unconvinced. But without any concrete evidence to support her accusations, she had little choice but to storm off, muttering threats about calling the police. Once she was gone, Greg closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. The confrontation had been intense, but it was also strangely exhilarating. For the first time in months, he felt like he had the upper hand. Still, as the adrenaline faded and reality set in, Greg couldn't shake the lingering unease in his stomach. He had achieved his goal. Karen's reckless behavior had finally caught up with her. But at what cost? Had he crossed a moral line he couldn't uncross? And more importantly, how would the rest of the neighborhood react when word got out about what had happened? Despite his doubts, Greg reminded himself that Karen had brought this upon herself. If she hadn't been so stubborn, so dismissive of his requests, none of this would have been necessary. Still, as he stared out at his now infamous lawn, he couldn't help but wonder whether winning this battle would ultimately come at too high a price. The aftermath of Karen's flat tires sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, turning what had been a private feud between two neighbors into a public spectacle that everyone wanted to talk about. Word spread quickly, almost too quickly for Greg's comfort. Within hours, whispers filled the air as residents gathered on porches, exchanged texts, and speculated about what had really happened. Some sided with Karen, claiming Greg must have gone too far by deliberately sabotaging her car. Others quietly sympathized with him, acknowledging that Karen's behavior had been out of line for far too long. But regardless of where people stood, one thing was certain. The quiet suburban peace everyone had taken for granted was now shattered. Karen wasted no time escalating the situation. Still fuming from the embarrassment of having her shiny red convertible stranded in the middle of Greg's lawn, she marched straight to the HOA board and filed a formal complaint. Her version of events painted Greg as a vindictive troublemaker who had intentionally laced his property with hidden hazards to damage her vehicle. She demanded an investigation, insisting that Greg be held accountable for his actions. "He's dangerous," she declared during the meeting, her voice trembling with indignation. What if someone else got hurt? What if it had been a child, instead of me? The HOA, caught in the crossfire once again, agreed to look into the matter. A small committee was formed to examine Greg's lawn and interview both parties involved. Greg attended the meetings calmly, sticking to his story that he had no idea how the spikes ended up under his sod. He pointed out that there were no visible obstacles or warning signs indicating foul play. It wasn't his fault if Karen chose to drive recklessly across his property. Privately, though, Greg couldn't help but feel uneasy. While he hadn't technically broken any laws, he knew deep down that burying spikes in his lawn, even harmless ones, was morally questionable at best. As the investigation dragged on, tensions in the neighborhood reached an all-time high. Karen made sure everyone knew how aggrieved she felt, posting passive-aggressive updates on social media and dropping not-so-subtle hints during casual conversations with neighbors. "Some people just don't know how to coexist peacefully," she said one afternoon while chatting with a group of women near the community mailbox. Though she never mentioned Greg by name, it was clear who she was referring to. Her tone dripped with self-righteousness, as if she were the victim in this scenario rather than the instigator. Greg, meanwhile, tried to keep a low profile. He avoided eye contact with Karen whenever their paths crossed and declined invitations to neighborhood gatherings, fearing he'd become the center of unwanted attention. But staying out of sight didn't stop the gossip from swirling around him. People began looking at him differently, as though seeing him for the first time. The man who had once been known for his meticulously maintained lawn and friendly demeanor was now viewed with suspicion. Was he truly capable of such calculated retaliation? Or was Karen exaggerating her side of the story to save face? Despite the mounting pressure, Greg refused to admit guilt. During the HOA hearings, he remained composed, answering questions politely, and presenting himself as a reasonable homeowner simply trying to protect his property. When asked why he hadn't reported the presence of spikes earlier, he shrugged and said, "I honestly didn't know they were there. Maybe someone else put them there as a prank, or maybe they've been there for years without me noticing." His explanation sounded plausible enough to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of some committee members. Karen, however, wasn't satisfied. She pushed hard for punitive action against Greg, arguing that even if he hadn't placed the spikes himself, his negligence in failing to remove them made him partially responsible for the incident. She presented photos of her damaged tires as evidence, along with estimates from mechanics detailing the costly repairs she'd need to fix her car. The total came to several $1,000s, a figure that left many neighbors gasping in disbelief. Whether intentional or not, Karen's dramatic presentation served its purpose. It painted Greg as financially reckless and emotionally unstable. Amidst the chaos, Greg found himself reflecting on the choices that had led him here. At first, his decision to bury the spikes had seemed justified, a necessary evil to teach Karen a lesson she wouldn't forget. But now, as the consequences unfolded before him, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of regret gnawing at his conscience. Had he let his anger cloud his judgment? Could he have handled the situation differently without resorting to such drastic measures? These questions haunted him day and night, making it difficult to focus on anything else. One evening, as Greg sat alone in his living room staring at the blank TV screen, he realized something important. Winning this battle wasn't worth losing: his integrity. Yes, Karen had treated him unfairly, and yes, she deserved to face consequences for her actions. But stooping to her level, engaging in sabotage and deception, had only made things worse. Instead of resolving the conflict, it had escalated into a full-blown war that neither side could win. Worse still, it had tarnished his reputation and alienated him from the very community he called home. Determined to set things right, Greg decided to take responsibility for everything. Not just for the spikes, which he admitted privately to himself were his doing, but also for allowing the feud to spiral out of control. He wrote a heartfelt letter to the HOA, apologizing for any role he may have played in creating unsafe conditions on his property. In the letter, he acknowledged that while Karen's behavior had been frustrating, his response had been disproportionate and potentially harmful. He pledged to remove the remaining spikes immediately and restore his lawn to its original state, ensuring it posed no further risk to anyone. When the HOA received Greg's letter, they were taken aback by his candor. While some members still harbored doubts about his innocence, others admired his willingness to own up to his mistakes. It was a rare display of accountability in a dispute that had grown increasingly contentious over time. Even Karen, who initially dismissed the letter as an insincere attempt to deflect blame, couldn't deny the sincerity behind Greg's words. For the first time since the incident, cracks began to form in her armor of indignation. The HOA ultimately ruled in favor of Greg, not because they believed him completely innocent, but because Karen failed to provide concrete proof of his wrongdoing. Without definitive evidence tying him to the placement of the spikes, they concluded that punishing him would be unfair. However, they did issue a stern warning to both parties, urging them to resolve their differences amicably and avoid future conflicts. They also recommended that Greg install more visible barriers around his lawn to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Though the ruling brought temporary relief, Greg knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding trust within the neighborhood would take time, and repairing his relationship with Karen, if that was even possible, would require patience and humility. As for Karen, the financial burden of repairing her car forced her to reconsider her habit of taking shortcuts through other people's property. While she never publicly apologized to Greg, her frequent glares during HOA meetings softened slightly over time, hinting at a begrudging acceptance of the situation. For Greg, the experience served as a painful yet valuable lesson. It reminded him that revenge, no matter how satisfying it might seem in the moment, rarely solves problems. It only creates new ones. Moving forward, he vowed to approach conflicts with greater maturity and restraint, prioritizing dialogue over retaliation. And though his lawn would eventually heal, the scars of this ordeal would remain etched in his memory, serving as a constant reminder of the importance of choosing peace over pride. The weeks following the HOA's ruling brought a fragile sense of calm to the neighborhood, but beneath the surface, tensions lingered. Greg worked tirelessly to repair not only his lawn, but also his damaged reputation. He removed every last spike from beneath the sod, double-checking each section of grass to ensure nothing remained hidden. Then he installed low wooden barriers along the edges of his property, this time reinforced with sturdy metal stakes to prevent them from being easily moved or driven over. Finally, he planted thick rows of thorny bushes near the road, creating a natural deterrent that would discourage anyone from attempting shortcuts in the future. While these measures were practical, they also carried symbolic weight for Greg. They represented a fresh start, a commitment to protecting his property without resorting to underhanded tactics. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope that life might return to normal. But deep down, he knew healing wouldn't happen overnight. The incident had left scars on more than just his lawn. It had fractured relationships and forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Karen, too, seemed quieter than usual. With her car repaired, at great personal expense, and her shortcut effectively blocked off, she no longer zipped through Greg's yard as part of her daily commute. Instead, she stuck to the main roads, avoiding eye contact whenever their paths crossed. Some neighbors speculated that she was embarrassed by the whole ordeal, while others believed she simply didn't want to give Greg the satisfaction of seeing her admit defeat. Either way, her absence from his lawn was noticeable, and for Greg, it felt like a small victory. But victories often come at a cost, and Greg couldn't ignore the toll this conflict had taken on him emotionally. Nights spent lying awake replaying conversations in his head, days filled with awkward exchanges and sideways glances from neighbors. It all weighed heavily on his shoulders. At times, he wondered if standing up to Karen had been worth it. Sure, she wasn't driving through his yard anymore, but at what expense? His once peaceful existence had turned into a whirlwind of drama and tension, leaving him questioning whether justice truly existed in situations like this. To cope, Greg began, focusing on rebuilding connections within the community. He started attending neighborhood events again, even volunteering for small projects organized by the HOA. At first, people treated him cautiously, unsure how to act around someone who had recently been embroiled in such controversy. But as Greg consistently showed kindness and humility, attitudes slowly shifted. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance began warming up to him, offering smiles and friendly greetings. One woman even thanked him for the improvements he'd made to his landscaping, saying it inspired her to tackle some long overdue projects in her own yard. Karen, however, remained an enigma. She continued showing up to HOA meetings, though her fiery speeches had lost much of their bite. Occasionally, she'd shoot Greg a frosty glare during discussions, but for the most part, she avoided direct interaction. It was as if both parties had silently agreed to coexist in uneasy neutrality, neither willing to reignite old hostilities nor extend an olive branch. Still, Greg noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She seemed less aggressive, less inclined to throw her weight around when disagreements arose. Perhaps the experience had humbled her in ways she wasn't ready to admit publicly, or perhaps she simply didn't want to risk another confrontation. As the months passed, Greg found himself reflecting on the lessons he'd learned from the ordeal. Chief among them was the realization that revenge rarely brings true satisfaction. Yes, watching Karen deal with flat tires had given him a fleeting sense of triumph, but it hadn't solved the underlying problem. In fact, it had only deepened the divide between them and drawn unwanted attention from the rest of the neighborhood. What he had gained in temporary gratification, he had lost in trust, respect, and peace of mind. This newfound perspective led Greg to approach conflicts differently moving forward. When disputes arose, which inevitably happened in any tight-knit community, he chose patience over anger, dialogue over retaliation. He reminded himself that misunderstandings could often be resolved with open communication rather than rash actions. And while it wasn't always easy to stay calm in the face of frustration, he took pride in knowing he was becoming a better version of himself. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Greg raked leaves in his front yard, he spotted Karen walking, her dog past his house. Their eyes met briefly before she quickly looked away, tugging on the leash to hurry along. For a moment, Greg considered calling out to her, to apologize for everything that had happened, to acknowledge that they had both played roles in escalating the feud. But something held him back. Maybe it was fear of rejection, or maybe it was the understanding that some wounds need more time to heal. Whatever the reason, he let her pass without saying a word. Instead, Greg focused on the present moment, the rustling leaves, the cool breeze brushing against his skin, the faint sound of children laughing somewhere down the street. Life in the neighborhood was far from perfect, but it was slowly returning to its peaceful rhythm. The scars of the past would always remain, serving as reminders of mistakes made and lessons learned. But so too would the resilience of human nature, the ability to adapt, grow, and move forward despite adversity. By winter, Greg's lawn was fully restored, lush and green once again. Snow blanketed the ground, hiding the remnants of tire marks and buried spikes beneath a pristine layer of white. As he stood on his porch sipping hot cocoa, watching the world go quiet under the season's first snowfall, Greg allowed himself to feel a sense of closure. The battle with Karen may have changed him, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had strengthened his resolve to live with integrity and grace, even when faced with challenges that tested his limits. And though Karen still occasionally glared at him during HOA meetings, Greg chose to meet her gaze with a calm smile. There was no animosity behind it, just an unspoken acknowledgement that they were two imperfect people trying to navigate the complexities of life in close quarters. Whether they liked it or not, they were part of the same community, a shared space where compromise and mutual respect mattered more than winning arguments or holding grudges. In the end, Greg realized that true victory wasn't about defeating your opponent. It was about finding balance. Balance between standing up for yourself and extending compassion to others. Between seeking justice and embracing forgiveness. Between protecting what you value most and letting go of what you can't control. And as the snow melted away to reveal spring's first buds, Greg felt ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead, with patience, perseverance, and a renewed appreciation for the beauty of second chances.